My family scheduled a conference call to vote on whether my business partnership shares belonged to my brother, the same man who'd burned through 3 failed ventures on our parents' dime, while telling everyone he was between opportunities. I was sitting in my car in a hospital parking garage, 4 hours after a miscarriage I hadn't even told them about yet, when my mother texted me the agenda. They needed me to sign over my 40% stake in the family logistics company for the good of everyone. I didn't call back screaming. I didn't beg. I typed one line: "Send me the paperwork. I'll sign whatever you want." Then I drove home and started making calls of my own, because what none of them remembered, in all their certainty, was that I wasn't actually the one who needed their signature. They needed mine. I'm Theodora Vance Whitlock. Everyone calls me Teddy, except my mother, who only ever used my full name when she was building up to something. I'm 34. I run operations for a mid-size cold chain logistics company in Charlotte, North Carolina, and for 15 years I told myself my family loved me in their own complicated way. That's the lie you tell yourself when you're the responsible one. You convince yourself that being needed is the same thing as being valued. My father, Harold, started Vance Freight Solutions in 1991 out of a single lease truck and a Rolodex of furniture warehouses that trusted him because he never missed a delivery. Not once, not even during the ice storm 96, when half the county lost power for a week. My mother, Diane, kept the books in the early years, sitting at our kitchen table with a calculator and a ledger long after the rest of us had gone to bed. By the time I was in high school, Vance Freight had 11 trucks and contracts with 3 regional grocery chains. We weren't rich, but we were comfortable in that specific Southern way where everyone in the church parking lot knew your name and your father's truck logo. My brother Garrett is 2 years older than me. He was the kind of kid who could charm a teacher into raising a grade without ever turning in the assignment that earned it. He played quarterback for 2 seasons before a knee injury ended his football future, which my parents discussed for years afterward, like it had been a presidential assassination. I played soccer, got a partial academic scholarship to NC State, and majored in supply chain management because I genuinely loved the puzzle of it: how a crate of strawberries gets from a field in California to a shelf in Charlotte before it spoils. Nobody at our dinner table ever asked me a follow-up question about my major. They asked Garrett what he was thinking about doing next, every single year, like his potential was a renewable resource that never expired, no matter how many times it failed to produce anything. When I graduated, I went to work for a competitor for 3 years to learn operations from the outside, the way my father had taught me to always learn from someone who wasn't obligated to be kind to me. Then I came home and rebuilt Vance Freight's routing software from scratch, cutting fuel costs by 18% in the first year. My father started calling me the engine at company meetings, which embarrassed me, and also made something in my chest unclench for the first time in years. In return for 4 years of 60-hour weeks where I turned a struggling regional carrier into a company worth real money, my father restructured the ownership. He gave me 40%. He gave Garrett, who by then had cycled through a car detailing business, a consulting firm with no clients, and a brief, expensive flirtation with selling protein powder online, 20%, to keep him invested in the family. My parents kept the remaining 40 between them. I told myself that was fair. I told myself a lot of things were fair. Garrett's failures kept happening on a schedule like weather. Every 18 months or so he'd need money. The protein powder venture cost my parents $60,000 in inventory that sat in our old garage rotting because Garrett never set up real distribution. The consulting firm cost them an office lease they paid for 9 months after he stopped showing up. Each time, my mother would say the same thing at Sunday dinner: "He just needs one good break, Teddy. Not everyone finds their footing as fast as you did." I used to think that sentence was a compliment. It took me a long time to understand it was an accusation. 3 years ago, Garrett married a woman named Cressida, who worked in real estate and had what my mother called vision, which I came to understand meant Cressida was very good at identifying exactly how much money other people had and exactly how to position herself near it. Cressida did not work for Vance Freight. Cressida did not know what a bill of lading was. But Cressida attended every family gathering with a notebook, asking pointed questions about the company's growth trajectory and long-term equity distribution. And my mother started looking at Cressida the way she used to look at Garrett's old football trophies, like proof that something in the family was still destined for greatness. I got married last year to a man named Julian Reyes Forsyth, who is a structural engineer and the single steadiest person I have ever known. He proposed at the exact restaurant where I'd had my first post-college job interview, which he remembered because I'd told him the story once, years earlier in passing. He listens to the end of a sentence before he responds. My family found him quiet, which from them was never a compliment either. The trouble really started 8 months ago, when my father had a stroke. It wasn't catastrophic, thank God. He recovered most of his speech and almost all of his mobility within a few months, but it scared all of us in a way that rearranged something in the family's center of gravity. While my father was still in the hospital, unable to speak clearly, my mother started making decisions about the company that weren't hers to make, because on paper, she only owned 20%. I held 40. My father, even from his hospital bed, still held 20. Garrett held the other 20. For any major decision, a sale, a transfer, a restructuring, the bylaws my father had drawn up years earlier required a 60% supermajority of shares to agree. My mother needed me. I want to be honest about something. For about 6 weeks after the stroke, my family was kind to me again, in a way I hadn't felt since I was small. My mother called every day. Garrett texted me articles about stroke recovery he'd cleaned for 2 minutes. Cressida sent a fruit basket. I told myself, in the exhausted, grateful, vulnerable haze of that period, that maybe this was the thing that would finally bring us back together as a real family. I drove 2 hours each way to sit with my father 3 times a week. I took over his physical therapy schedule. I quietly absorbed an extra 20 hours a week of his old responsibilities at Vance Freight on top of my own job, without anyone formally asking me to, because someone had to, and I have never in my life been able to watch something I built start to fail without trying to catch it. What I didn't know during those 6 weeks was that Cressida had been meeting with a logistics conglomerate out of Atlanta that wanted to acquire smaller regional carriers and fold them into a national network. She'd found them through a real estate client. She brought the idea to my mother while I was at the hospital holding my father's hand through a speech therapy session, framing it as a rescue. My father was incapacitated, the company needed stability, and a buyout would set the family up for generations. The number on the table was $4 million for the whole company. Garrett's 20% alone, post-sale, would clear $800,000, more money than he had ever once held on to for longer than a year. There was only one problem standing between Garrett and Cressida and $800,000. They needed 60% of the shares to approve a sale. My mother's 20 plus Garrett's 20 was only 40. They needed me. I found out about the offer the same week I found out I'd lost the baby Julian, and I had been trying for over a year to have. I was 9 weeks along. I hadn't told my family yet, because we'd lost one before, early, and I had learned the hard way that my mother's comfort during hard times always came with a quiet undertone of management, as though my grief was a project she needed to optimize. I went to a routine appointment alone, because Julian had sight inspection he couldn't move, and the ultrasound tech got very quiet, and then a doctor I'd never met came in and sat down across from me in a way doctors only sit when they're about to tell you something is over. I drove myself home. I sat in our driveway for 40 minutes before I could make myself walk inside, and that was the day my mother chose to call me with the family's decision. She didn't ask if I'd sell. She told me the family had discussed it and reached a consensus, and that the most reasonable path forward, given my father's health and the family's collective best interest, was for me to agree to the sale so the deal could close before the Atlanta company's offer window expired. She said Garrett and Cressida had already spoken to a lawyer about drafting the transfer paperwork. She said it the way you'd announce a change in Thanksgiving plans, like there was nothing for me to actually weigh in on, just paperwork for me to sign. I sat in that car in the hospital parking garage, still raw from an appointment my mother didn't know had happened, listening to her explain that the company I had personally rebuilt, the company whose software still ran on architecture I'd written line by line on nights I couldn't sleep, was being sold out from under me by people who had never once asked what I wanted it to become. Mom, I said, are you saying this is already decided? We took a vote, Teddy. Your father agrees too, in spirit. He knows the stress of running things isn't good for him anymore. Garrett and Cressida have already started the paperwork. We just need your signature, and if I don't agree? There was a pause, and then she said the sentence that I have replayed more times than I can count since. Why do you always have to make everything about you? This is about the family. This is about taking care of your father. You've always made it so hard to just be on the same team. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. Something in me had gone very still and very clear, the way water gets right before it freezes. I said, "Send me the paperwork. I'll sign whatever you want." And I hung up, and I drove home, and I did not tell Julian what had happened to the pregnancy or what had happened on that phone call until later that night, because I needed an hour first to just sit with both griefs side by side and understand which one I actually had the power to do something about. Here is what my family did not know. What I had quietly built over the 4 years since my father restructured the ownership, in the gaps between my 60-hour weeks, the way you build a foundation underneath a house nobody's watching. When my father gave me 40% advance freight, he also gave me, almost as an afterthought, during a meeting with his estate attorney, the title to the warehouse and dispatch facility the company operated out of. The land and the building had been purchased separately from the company itself, years earlier, as a tax structuring move my father's accountant had recommended. My father owned it personally at the time. When he restructured everything, he transferred the real estate into a holding LLC and named me sole managing member, because, in his words, "You're the one who'll still be driving past it in 30 years, Teddy, not your brother." He told me this almost in passing, the way you mentioned you changed the oil in someone's car. I don't think he understood at the time what that piece of paper would eventually mean. I'm not sure I fully understood it either, not until I needed it. Vance Freight Solutions did not own the building it operated out of. I did. You cannot sell a logistics company's operations, its fleet, its contracts, and walk away with a clean $4 million acquisition if the buyer would be acquiring a business that has no legal right to occupy its own dispatch facility, its own loading docks, its own walk-in coolers for the perishable freight contracts that made up 60% of our revenue. Any due diligence team worth its retainer would have found this within the first week of real document review. Cressida, for all her vision, had clearly never gotten that far. She'd been selling my mother a fantasy built on a number, not a contract. I spent the next 9 days doing two things. I went to grief counseling twice, alone, because Julian and I needed different things in that window and I needed to not perform my grief for an audience for once. And I called my own attorney, a woman named Priscilla Adeyemi Voss, who had represented me in a dispute with a vendor 2 years earlier, and who, when I laid out the situation, went quiet on the phone for a long moment, and then said, "Teddy, I need you to understand that you are not in a weak position here. You are in the strongest position in this entire negotiation, and I don't think your family has any idea. We didn't go to war immediately. I, I want to be clear about that, because I think the version of this story people want is the version where I storm in and blow everything up. And that's not who I am, and it's not what I did. I told Priscilla I wanted one meeting, in person, at the company's conference room, with my parents Garrett and Cressida present, and I wanted the asset purchase agreement Cressida's team had drafted on the table before anyone said another word. My mother thought I had finally come around. She texted me a smiley face the morning of the meeting. I have never read 4 small yellow pixels and felt less. We sat in the same conference room where my father used to run Monday morning logistics meetings, where I'd sat at 16 doing homework in the corner while he negotiated fuel contracts. Cressida had a binder. Garrett wore a blazer he clearly didn't normally wear to the office, the kind of outfit you put on for a job interview or a court appearance. My mother sat with her hands folded in a way I recognized from church, the posture she used when she wanted to project calm certainty. "I want to thank you all for putting this together," Cressida started, sliding a copy of the agreement toward me. "I know the timing has been difficult with your father's health, and we really tried to structure this in a way that protects everyone." I read it, I said. Section 4, Asset Transfer. It lists the dispatch facility at 2040 Yorkmont Road as a company-owned asset included in the sale. "It is a company asset," Cressida said, the first thread of uncertainty entering her voice. "It isn't," I said. "It's owned by Whitlock Property Holdings, an LLC I've been sole managing member of for 4 years. Vance Freight leases the facility from the LLC under an operating agreement my father set up before his stroke. You can pull the county property records this afternoon if you'd like." The room did the thing rooms do when the temperature actually changes, not figuratively, you could feel it. Garrett looked at our mother. Our mother looked at me with an expression I'd genuinely never seen on her face before, something between confusion and the beginning of fear. "That doesn't make sense," my mother said. "Your father would have told me that." "He told the attorney handling his estate plan," I said. "It's been in the filing since the restructuring." I assume you never asked to see the documents because you trusted Dad to handle it, and I never brought it up because, frankly, Mom, it never occurred to me I'd need to. Cressida's composure cracked first, which told me everything about how much of this had actually been her idea. So what, you're just going to torpedo this deal out of spite? This is $4 million. This is generational wealth for this family. I'm not torpedoing anything, I said, and this is the part I'd practiced with Priscilla, because I wanted to say it exactly right, without heat, the way my father used to deliver bad news to a vendor. Clearly, factually, with no room for negotiation disguised as conversation. Vance Freight can absolutely be sold. I'm not opposed to a sale in principle if it's the right deal at the right time, voted on by people who actually have the legal standing to make that decision with full information. What can't happen is selling a company's operating rights to a building that company doesn't own, without the consent of the person who does own it. So here's what I'll need if this deal is going to close. A new operating agreement between the buyer and Whitlock Property Holdings, on commercially reasonable terms that I negotiate directly. And full transparency to every shareholder, including Dad, who I notice nobody actually asked. They just told me he agreed in spirit, about every term of the sale before any vote happens. You're being vindictive, my mother said, her voice rising. After everything this family has done for you. What, Mom? I said, and here is where my voice did shake just slightly. Because 4 years of being the one who fixes things and 9 days of grieving a child nobody in that room had asked me about finally met in the same sentence. What has this family done for me, specifically that Garrett hasn't also received, except expect more of me while explaining less to me? I drove 2 hours each way 3 times a week to sit with Dad. I covered his workload on top of mine without being asked. And while I was doing that, you were in here deciding to sell the thing I built, without telling me there was even a decision being made until it was supposedly already final. You didn't include me in this. You informed me. There's a difference, and I don't think you've ever actually understood that, because the difference has never cost you anything before. Nobody said anything for a long moment. My father, who had insisted on attending despite his doctor's concerns, and had been sitting quietly at the end of the table in his wheelchair, finally spoke. His words still a little slow from the stroke but entirely clear. "Diane," he said to my mother, "did you really tell her it was already decided?" My mother didn't answer him. That told me more than anything she could have said. I left the meeting without signing anything. Over the next 3 weeks, the Atlanta buyers team did their own due diligence, found exactly what I'd told them they would find, and came back with a restructured offer, one that required the SLC's separate cooperation and critically valued the real estate component as its own line item. I negotiated that portion myself, with Priscilla beside me, and structured the lease-to-buyer terms so that I retained ownership of the land and building, and the new parent company would pay me directly, in perpetuity, for the facility lease, completely separate from any company sale proceeds. My father, once he reviewed the full terms with his own attorney present, recommended the family proceed with the sale on those revised terms. My 40% of the company sold for $1.6 million. The lease agreement on the property generates $11,000 a month, indefinitely, in my name only. Garrett and Cressida got their $800,000, bought a house in a neighborhood I won't name, and from what I hear through people who still talk to my mother, Cressida has already started talking about the next opportunity, which Garrett, predictably, does not yet have. My mother and I are still talking, technically. It's different now, careful in a way that's almost more honest than the warmth was. She apologized once in a phone call for how it was handled, not for what was decided, and I told her I appreciated her saying that, and I meant it, and I also didn't pretend it closed the distance between us, because it didn't. My father and I talk every week. He's slower these days, but the first real conversation we had after the meeting. He told me he was proud of me in a tone I'd never once heard him use. Not when I cut fuel costs 18%, not when I rebuilt the routing software, not at my wedding. "You didn't just protect yourself," he said. "You made them tell the truth. I should have made them do that a long time ago. Julian and I are trying again when we're ready, on our own timeline, on nobody else's schedule. I quit the operations job once the sale closed. There was a clean exit clause built into the deal, and a year of consulting retainer attached to it that I structured myself. And I spend a few hours a week now managing the property holding company, which mostly means making sure the new parent company pays its lease on time. Which it always does, because they have excellent lawyers now too, the kind who read every line before they let anyone sign anything. I think about that phone call sometimes, the one in the hospital parking garage. My mother's voice telling me the family had already decided that I was the one making everything difficult by existing as a person with my own stake in something. I think about how certain she sounded. I think about how none of them, not once, in 15 years of being the one who showed up, ever stopped to ask what I actually owned, what I'd actually built, what was actually mine to give away or not give away. They forgot, the whole time, that you cannot vote away something you never bothered to understand. You didn't have a right to in the first place.